So I had a meeting on Sunday where I was here. We had the whole room set up as a conference room and had 6 people join us from Greater Portland, a couple of agents and some buyers and sellers to talk about the NAR settlement, what it means, some of the summary stuff. I'm sure everybody here has read that. Obviously, it's a pretty important thing for all of us in our industry. And really what I wanted to do with this meeting is field questions and talk about it as a team. And before we go much further, obviously Mitch is recording the hell out of this, so we don't have to worry about this too much. But I know that a couple people wanted to make sure that we were recording it and could share that. So we'll make sure that that happens for everyone here. So I know there's some questions that we've received, and again, I'm not going to get into what the settlement is really about. You should take time, as this is a big deal. It's probably the biggest thing to come down the pike in real estate. I was saying since COVID, but it certainly is probably even, for the last 50 odd years, this could change the very fabric of what we do and how we do it. You hope not, but I mean, I can get into more of that later. So before I go into anything, I mean, this to me is not so much about me giving you a download. We do have a document and a fact sheet and sort of a quick summary that we're going to modify, and you can share that, and we'll make it a little more generic, and you can share that with your sphere and your clients versus you coming up with something on your own. So we'll take whatever I did, make it generic, we'll send it out to the entire company, and that way there you'll be, something that you can share via MailChimp or et cetera. I know Jackie works with a lot of you to get those MailChimp things out. So good idea to be on the forefront of this versus clients coming to you. Now, within days of this happening, I probably had 10 phone calls from people, right? Should I sell now? Should I wait? Should I wait till the summer? Should I wait till the fall? How is this going to impact me? Are you still going to charge me 5% or whatever that may be? So there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of uncertainty. I had family members asking me. I have a brother who was thinking of selling this spring. He says, should I wait until the summer and the fall and maybe save some money? Of course, I have an opinion about that. So, but before we get into too much of that, I guess I wanted to pause, field any questions that you guys may have and some things that you may have heard from clients and strategize around these things. Is anybody heard some things and wants to share them and just threw them on the table so we can all talk about that?
There are a lot of questions out there, and I'm using the resources that I have to just answer those the best that I can, and just to assure them like how business is going. But I myself just have questions on what I'm reading and the consistency of it. And that's what I was hoping to get at this meeting today, is just to make sure that what I'm getting in the source material out there, I'm explaining it correctly to the clients that are coming to me with questions.
Yeah, so what are you in particular seeing that you're, I guess, questioning that's maybe pivoted, or I mean, what are some of your I guess concerns about what you're seeing?
So their questions are basically how this is going to be different than how we've been doing things in the past, with the inflated cost for the prices in the home, and also how are my buyers going to be able to afford their buyer representation if things are going to be different, and what it looks like outside of how to negotiate the commissions outside the MLS, since we're not supposed to be listing them anymore on the MLS.
Yeah, this is a bit of a minefield for real estate agents and companies. So, this is part of that initial conversation that I think, it's dual facing, or maybe even 3 fronts of this thing, right? There's agents and our policies and how we're going to navigate this as agents and agencies, and what that means with cooperating agencies. And then there's how's this going to affect buyers, right? There's that whole conversation there. And how is it going to affect sellers? So I think there's these 3 fronts to this. And some of it is really evolving. Obviously, as we know, this has only been out there for about 2 weeks now. And there's a lot of unknowns. Now, and maybe there's no set way that this is going to go forward. There's multiple different ways based on different agencies. And I've thought about this literally daily as you sort of try to get your head around this. When you first hear the news about it, you're like, wow, this is really going to fundamentally change everything. And how are we going to navigate this? If I'm a buyer, if I think about that front, how am I going to then take on that cost of that if the person I'm working with then is not being paid by the seller and it's not wrapped into that mortgage? I mean, how am I going to find somebody to work with? So it's an interesting conversation, and I think one that will evolve over the next 3 months here between now and the time that NAR and MAR introduce new documents for us to use with people, which on the buyer side, I think are going to pump up some of that language that says, hey, you're responsible. That buyer is responsible. It's not the way it is now. It's caused me to be paid is sort of the idea around this. Is through the buyer's actions, the buyer is not necessarily, paying you, but they cause you to be paid, which I think some of that language is going to have to be changed. And I think we're going to have real conversations about what is that minimum, and we're going to have to update our company policy around this. Is okay if you have a seller who fails to pay the buyer anything. Where is that money coming from? What are we saying is your minimum? Or is there even a minimum? And is there a retainer at the beginning? Now, we never did these. That's on the document. Maybe there is something like that, because the idea is you'd have that agreement with them, but then you would be 3 months, 6 months, whatever it was, to working with this person, and hopefully get paid at the end, and it's significant. But maybe there's some changes around that too, and we start to think creatively about that. Maybe it's not a company policy sort of thing. I guess I don't know. I don't know all the answers yet, but this is part of what we need to talk about, where the company takes a percentage. But maybe it's up to you guys to determine, are you willing to work for $500 over the course of 3 months? Boy, I don't think I would want to do that, right? So how do we try to either get the buyer to pay us a fair amount or demand that of a seller? So again, that's that buyer front, right? We've had some pretty good luck, and it's ironic that we were starting to do this with these uneven commission splits, right? This trend that was happening over the last couple of years, where we saw somebody charging 6%, keeping 4%, giving 2%. We had put it right in the purchase and sale from our attorneys to say, hey, you're going to give me half of that up to a certain amount. Now, the half can go away, but you can put that in your purchase and sale. So we're going to continue to think about that, and that becomes, again, the idea of the negotiations between the buyer broker right to that seller. So I don't know what you guys' reaction is to that, or what your thoughts are around, let's just maybe take the first prong of that, the buyer prong. I mean, Courtney, you're sitting across from me, you're tremendously experienced. I mean, if you think about that buyer side of this, I mean, where do you think this is going to land, and how do we navigate this?
I think that we'd have to see, I mean, obviously this is just a proposed settlement, so we'd have to see what really gets approved, and then really sort through all the confusion, and there's been a lot of clickbaity kind of headlines on what impacts this will have. I think we have to kind of sort through that and figure out what impacts there really will be. We'll have to work with counsel and MAR to find out what options buyers really do have. I think even on the lending side, they're going to have to figure out, like, you know, if a seller is refusing to pay a buyer or a buyer's agent, can they roll that into their closing costs? Like, how do you handle appraisals when that happens? You know, there's a lot of questions around that that we'll have to address. My concern would be that buyers may just go unrepresented because I mean, most first-time home buyers can't afford that kind of expense. So it could go back to being the wild, wild west a little bit, where people aren't being appropriately represented, or there's a bit of a conflict of interest there with the seller's agent automatically a little bit. I would have big concerns about that.
Okay. I agree. Yeah, everybody's, or somebody's not being represented at all. They're a transaction broker for the buyer, but they're really representing the seller. So, you know, again, we got to control the narrative on this, and that's part of getting this information out and then continuing to get that information out to our clients to say, hey, we've read it, we know it, here's what it means. And a lot of this stuff, keep in mind, is national. And a lot of the settlement was on things that don't apply here in Maine, and that's what we talk about a lot of here is like, well, buyer brokerage agreements in writing. That's one of the big things. Well, they've always been in writing, and it's been a requirement here. I guess maybe a few of us may not do that right away. We may not have them sign that, but you know, that's company policy, and that's pretty much a standard in the industry. All right, who else around the buyer side? Maybe, again, we just take that front. Any other thoughts or reactions to that and how we're going to navigate it?
Hey, Tom. This is Jake.
Hey, Jay.
I was talking to another agent friend of mine who works for another brokerage, and the conversation that he's having, which I thought sounded pretty good, talking to buyers, is you have an exclusive agreement with me, no retainer. I'm going to try to get the commission for my side from the listing agent, but right now, the listing agent charges whatever they want, and typically that is, 5-6%, but that's a negotiable number. And what we've done is that you pay me as the listing agent, and I pay the other broker, the buyer's agent. You're paying me as a listing agent, and I am choosing to share my 5%, or whatever that number is, evenly with if they're not paying anything, then the 2.5% would come from you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've thought about that too, Jake. I think that actually is an interesting spin on that, right? And I think that gets into how the mechanics of it work. So the structure may not change, the percentages may not really change, and they shouldn't. That's the other message that we have to make sure that we talk to clients. Both sides, as Courtney talked about, need qualified representation. They really do. It's the biggest financial decision in people's lives. It is incredibly complicated. There are tons of pitfalls, and you need independent representation in a conflicting sort of interest situation, right? So I like that, and I do think that's an interesting way to think about it. So I, as the listing agent, I get all 5, and then that buyer broker submits sort of an invoice to me, and then I pay them. And that seems doable. I think it's a bit complicated back in the office about how Benchmark is now paying RE/MAX by the Bay a portion of commission, but I think we can navigate through that. Is that the sort of thought around that?
Well, I think that the number one thing is to emphasize that it's a negotiable number. It's always been negotiable. That's one of the things that I've been reading over and over that the press is getting wrong, is that there was some fixed 6% that now they've done away with. That was never the case. And it's a negotiable number. And the listing agent is the one that made the decision all along as to what the other party would get. If it was 2.5%, if it was 3%, if it was, something else. Yeah, I think basically saying that the listing agent gets the commission and they choose to split the commission however they see fit, we think that a 50-50 split is equitable, and that number, whether it's 5%, 6%, 5.5%, that's a negotiable number.
Right.
For the listing agent.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, and that's one of the comments that I fielded on Facebook, Jake, is this idea that when I, again, trying to, frame this in a way that, folks could understand, because you read so many different things, and the clickbait, as Courtney talks about, these headlines that are just, it's the death of this, or that, they're selling this to sensationalization.
Right.
And that doesn't serve anybody at all. But then when you get into the nitty gritty of it, people go with that, and then they're like, well, you're telling me that it probably is not going to change and it shouldn't change, Tom, but that's not what I'm hearing in the media. So I think that's a really good point of reference to make sure we go back and say, hey guys, that is something that we need to address and make sure that both sides are competitively paid and paid equitably, and it really may not change dramatically. Now, again, this person was more around the idea of, do I still have to pay 6% then? Is that what you're saying to me, Tom? And I said, you never did. There's been so many different models out there, from flat rate $500 to list your house, to 5 and 6% models, to discount models, to help you sell, to enter only. I mean, you name it. You've always had the option to choose to do it with nobody, right? Sort of like pulling your own teeth, or to go to the best dentist in the world, right? And pay hopefully a higher amount. Now, the interesting thing I think about our industry, and this is something that I've tried to talk to people about over the years, is most of the time in our industry, the person who got their license last week is charging you the same amount as the person who's been doing it for 25, 30 years and is the most accomplished. Now, that's unheard of in nearly any other industry, that you can get the most accomplished person for the same amount of money as the senior partner in a law firm, right? I mean, this doesn't happen otherwise, right? So I think that's another way to control that narrative and repaint this in people's heads, where you always have the option and you can always negotiate. But let's look at the pluses and minuses of that negotiation. If you offer nothing to somebody, is that good for your best interest, Mr. and Mrs. Seller?
Right.
I don't think so.
Absolutely.
Right? So these are the conversations that we're already having with people around that. And maybe it wasn't happening as much in the past. Now, the other part is interesting. You talked about, Jake, and maybe we can put this on the table, is, okay, I meet with a seller and the seller says, no, I'll pay you 3 or 2.5, but I ain't paying that other person, no matter what you say. And then how do we navigate that? What are our thoughts around that?
If you were to say that to me and I was a listing agent, I would say, if you're offering the buyer agent nothing, you're going to see fewer buyers, more than likely. Do you really want to do that? Do you really want to save a couple of $1,000 and risk the fact that you won't get the showings and you won't get the traffic that you think you will?
Yeah, and I would agree with you. Again, reframing that for them, making sure they understand that's not in their best interest. But if they say no, then it really does fall on the buyer, right? To pay them, I guess, right?
Sorry, I think that one of the biggest things with this is going to be having to generally educate people on what a seller's agent does and what a buyer's agent does. The general public doesn't think about that until they have to buy a house or they have to sell their house. And I don't know if they're if you refuse to pay a buyer's agent through your commission, if you're selling a house, and you get a buyer that doesn't have representation, does that then open you up to any sort of lawsuits in the future or anything, if there's something wrong with the house? If it's not,
It could.
if it's been handled properly through the right channels, by professionals that are licensed, like, as a seller, wouldn't you be taking on that, liability then?
So it's a very interesting point, Jackie. I think there's always liability. There's liability whether you have an agent to help you or you don't. I think the idea of having an agent help you on both sides of that is that they hopefully are, because again, like you talked about, the layperson, the general public does this 3 times in their lives, right? We're doing this weekly and monthly, multiple times. So the idea is to make sure that you're there to advise them on things that they know about and don't know about and could never know about, from law to disclosures to you name it. So it's interesting to think about, if I'm a seller, do I have some potential liability there if the buyer's not represented? And I think you do. Now, if you're represented, I think it mitigates that a little bit. It doesn't, negate the fact that if you had something that you knew about and you didn't disclose it, let's just say there was a leak in the basement, and suddenly the buyer finds out that leak year 1 in the spring, and found out also that you knew about it and you covered it up, or didn't reveal that. So I think there's some risk there. I think there's also major pitfalls for buyers, and that's something too, Jackie, where I think a lot of people don't understand that. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter. We're just going to have to go over asking anyways, and that's been the market for the last several years. What is my tour guide, buyer, broker? They're just touring and open up houses, right? It couldn't be any further from the truth. Sometimes it is. If a market is emerging and the values are going like this, and you really want a house, it is advising you about, hey, they purposely underpriced it, and if you really want that house, here's what you have to do. But that's also advice. That's informed advice, right, to potentially go over to make your offer attractive. But on the flip side of that, markets go up and down. And we're in a market which is a bit of an interesting market right now for buyers and sellers, where not everything's going over, but some things are, and some things are going under. We just helped somebody, look at, probably 30 houses. They offered on 3 of them over the course of the last 4 or 5 months. And we were able to drive some really good bargains. We also kept them out of significant hot water. And the team kicked in to really understand the background of the buyer, the general contractor who did the work on the house, the developer, all of these types of things. And boy, that buyer would have been screwed on the other side of that. And would they've had liability and be able to sue the seller? I guess. But I think a lot of sellers would say, bring it on. I've already cashed my check. So it's like buyer beware, right? So.
Right. I guess it's just more like, let's make sure that we say all that in our marketing too, moving forward, and really stress the value of what a buyer's agent, because I think it's probably going to affect the buyer's agents more than, from my understanding of it, more than the seller's agent. But then to Jake's point, like, if somebody is refusing to split the commission on like the listing agents, and you can say, like, you won't get as many buyers, you won't get as many informed buyers, and you could open yourself up to litigation in the future if you don't work with the professionals that will cover your butt in this.
Yeah, I think, again, just playing off of that again, I think you're bringing up a really, really good point, Jackie. And this idea, and I've talked to sellers about this. You want to have a good buyer broker on the other side, because they are walking around with somebody that they've vetted, that they're legitimate, and they know that they're qualified. If I'm working with you as a seller and I don't know anything about that person, and they could be coming in with a loan pre-approval that is basically worthless. You can get them online in about 20 minutes. And they may get under contract. They may blow up the deal. What's that?
I said the rocket money, like fly
Yes.
by night, like whatever, that never really go through, or they say they're pre-approved and then like something comes up after, it's just not. I think you do need a professional. You just need to be able to sort of send that message of like, this is the value that we add to this super important thing in your life.
And I think making sure the seller knows that as well. I think that's part of that point. Yeah.
I would be curious to see, ultimately real data around if you refuse to pay a buyer's agent, what are the real life consequences to how much money you walk away with in your pocket as a seller. If I'm saying I'm absolutely not going to pay any buyer's agents because I want to save this $5,000, hypothetically speaking, probably doing away with 95% of the buyer pool. I don't think we're going to have a bidding war at this point, because who's going to bid against who if 95% of them are gone? That will in the end affect your sales price. Maybe you just get exactly what you've asked for and not above list price anymore. It could actually, saving $5,000 could cost you $25,000, $30,000, $40,000.
Mm-hmm. This is the same logic, guys, of what we talk to people who are considering for sale by owners, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll shop agents, they'll have you come in, they'll give you a range, and they do this, and then they try to say, I'm going to try to sell this on my own to a coworker or a neighbor. Share the number that these 3 or 4 people gave me, and think that I'm saving this 3 to 5%. Usually they're just being foolish about that process, and I think you're right. There must be some data there that we could say, hey, that for sale by owner versus this, you're going to outpace them a lot more. You're going to get 10% more, 15% more because you paid that 5 or 6%, and that's good math. You would want to do that. So it's a perception that you're saving, but you're really not.
Right.
Yeah.
My mom has this saying that cheap is expensive. So when you try to go to the bottom of the barrel price-wise and cut costs, you end up actually spending more money, or it ends up costing you more money because you're getting, you're getting what you pay for, basically. And I think that definitely applies here as well, to Courtney's point.
I also just thinking out loud here, but I wonder if the interpretation or the perspective needs to be adjusted, where a seller's saying, I'm not paying a buyer's agent, but the buyer is kind of paying for it, right? It's their money. The buyer pays for their agent. It just goes into an escrow account, and then the title company divvies it up to all the different people. But that money comes from the buyer. They are paying, right? That's something that we don't really talk about a whole lot. Yes, the seller and their listing agent do make that decision, sure, but the money is coming from the buyer. They are paying for their own representation to that degree. I mean,
Courtney, again, you nailed it. I mean, this is the misnomer. The seller does not pay. The buyer pays. And this is something that's a fundamental misunderstanding in the world of real estate, because through that buyer's actions, they're paying more for the house, and the seller's turning around and paying that 5 or 6% commission. It's through the inflation of that price. Now, that is part of what they talk about in this lawsuit, that the house prices are inflated. But the belief then, and this has come up in some questions, I don't know if people have thought about this or feel that any of these is, does that mean prices are going to come down? And you can't help but chuckle about that, right? So just because I, don't hire the garage down the street for me to sell my vintage car, and they're going to take 6% and I sell it on my own, am I suddenly going to give that buyer a better deal and take off that commission at the garage? No. I'm going to put that in my pocket. So prices are not going to come down. I think that's totally out to lunch. Is it going to lead to a whole bunch more inventory? That's another question we're getting, and the media's talked about. How does that solve inventory problems? I mean, interest rates are interest rates. If I'm at 2.9 or 3.5, I'm going to think long and hard about leaving that. Hence,
Right.
A lot of people aren't selling their existing homes. And we don't have a lot of new inventory. So that's not going to fundamentally change any of that, in my opinion. So it's an interesting sort of, again, pivot on these things. Nicole, what are you guys fielding or seeing out there? Or what are your thoughts around these things?
Yeah, no, same as others, right? It's just scary, especially for home buyers right now, when home buyers are it's already hard hard on home buyers, and so it's just being able to like share that with folks and be like, not a whole lot of change as it already is, right? Like you're not paying more than you already are, I think is the message, you know what I mean? That we need to keep sharing out there. So it's hard right now for home buyers, especially new home buyers, right? This is gonna kind of scare folks into wanting to buy, even when rates start to come down, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting. Couple things there that I think about is, number one, and this is what I've been trying to say to folks, is no market's like uncertainty. Nobody likes an uncertainty anyways, right? Change, all of this type of stuff. And the human beings don't like that, right? So if this is the biggest change in real estate, really in any of our memories and lifetime, obviously, doing something now is probably a pretty damn good idea, right? Before this goes into effect in late July. So if you're a buyer, there's probably some pretty good evidence here that you should be doing something. And I think the spring is going to have a lot more listings. On the seller side as well, I don't know the ramifications of this. It could have no impact, it's sort of, we hope, or very, very little. Or it could be a fundamental shift in some way on how buyers are entering into the marketplace, and maybe buyers sort of hold off. So I do think there's an element of this, let's get on the market and take advantage of what should be a pretty good spring on both sides of that equation. But I think you're right, Nicole. I mean, this idea of especially first-time home buyers, and part of the settlement says, well, a seller on multiple listings can say that they're offering up to 3% of closing costs. Well, I think that's great. That may be this silver lining to this, because, well, ironically enough, it matches up with the 3% of commission, right? I mean, isn't that kind of a cool thing if that goes through, as Courtney says, and is part of the finished settlement, because that translates to just about the normal commission, right? But that doesn't help if you're in a multiple offer situation and you're trying to make yourself stand out, because that does inflate the price of the property. And not, if it's already going over, as we all know, very few sellers are going to then say, oh yeah, just tack on another 20 grand on top of that, because there's risk there that it doesn't appraise. And then the first-time home buyers don't have the money to bridge the gap. So they're just left out in the cold.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, Jake.
I had another issue I wanted to bring up, if now's an okay time.
Of course.
So I'm going to date myself here. I got my real estate license in Maryland, outside of DC, in the mid-'80s. And when I was in real estate, the first time around, I had a big gap in between coming back. We all represented the seller. Both agents represented the seller.
Right.
And one of the things, I mean, it was always negotiable, but 6% was the typical commission. But it was often the case, back in that market anyway, that you would see incentives for agents, gift cards, cash, even $2,000 if you bring me a buyer, full price, and all that. So there might be a development of a similar kind of situation where if buyer's agents end up not getting compensated very well, there might be incentives put out there. Is there anything that would prevent that from happening today? I'm not sure about the laws and all that, what had happened, because like I said, I got out of real estate and was in education for almost 30 years, so, I got a big kind of blank area, so.
Jake, I remember that time when I first bought properties in the early 90s. That was the way it was then, and so not a lot different than what you're talking about. When I got into the industry, buyer brokerage was really starting to take off, and it was sort of a thing at that time. But it wasn't long before that where that was a change. Buyer brokerage was something new. It was really, again, in that early to mid 90s that sort of took off, and then into the late 90s. I do remember times when especially, during the post 2008 crash, that you were begging buyers to come. It was a really, really rough time, as we all know, in many, many ways. But in the real estate world, it was incredibly, incredibly tough for sellers. You bought something for $600 and it's worth $350, and that's a very, very tough conversation. A lot of people lost their properties, but we offered incentives exactly like you're talking about. Most of them would come from the sellers, obviously, versus. But yeah, it was on top of the commission. Even it could be a $10,000 bonus, or So that's. I don't think
there's nothing in the law to prevent that from going on today. You never see it because the market is different.
Yeah. I don't believe so. We could check in that. I think it's a really interesting and clever thing to think about there, where maybe that is a way to somehow get around this. I do think back though, and I'm just thinking of a seller conversation I just had, and they were like, the buyer, they were almost putting down buyer brokers. Like they were like, I don't really see a lot of value. You're my listing agent. And that person can get 1% or whatever that is. I don't know how we're going to navigate that. As an agency, and I think in Portland and maybe greater Portland, this isn't price fixing and all this stuff. We got to think about how we're going to handle this as our company policy. But do we refuse a listing because the seller says, no, I'm just going to pay you? We got to think about that. I don't think so. But we also want to have a situation, because we can't advertise the cooperating commission, that, for me, selfishly, right, I do a fair amount of listings. I'm like, well, I'm going to then have out to the broker world, if you will, they know they're going to be taken care of if they bring a buyer to my listings. And that's sort of what I've been doing all along. I've never got into, it's not a company policy where we do uneven splits, because it looks like shit, right? That's one way for an agent maybe not to come show my listings. But if they know they're going to get an even treatment and they're going to get a good payday, I think that bodes well for them to say, yeah, I'm going to show one of Tom's properties, right? So I think if we can really craft and work on the messaging to sellers to say this is in your best interest, and really try to push them to a way that gets 4 or 5 or preferably, obviously, 6. And then that is a known thing in the industry, that we're known as a company that that's what we're doing, that we're not chasing the bottom here. That I think we're going to do a better job for our sellers and continue to sell our listings. But it hyper exacerbates the other side of things, which are, it's already kind of been sucky to be given 2 and somebody gets 4. This is that on steroids. So I don't have all the answers, guys. I don't know what your reaction is about that. How do we do that with sellers? How do we push them? So.
My plan is to take any listing I can get. I'm not going to turn down a listing if they're not going to compensate the buyers. I'll have that tough conversation with them, trying to get them to go there. But I wouldn't turn a listing if it was a decent listing. If it was some, listing that wasn't so desirable in the first place, mm-hmm. I would think about that. But just as a general rule, I don't think I would, turn down a listing if they weren't agreeable to compensating the buyer's agent.
Right. So we take the listing. I think that's a very good call, Jay. And we have the conversation, and we let them know that we fully anticipate that buyer broker coming back and asking us to compensate them, so to prep our seller, right? And if I'm the buyer broker, I think, again, making sure that we have some language in there, and again, this is not until mid to late July, that says that we can all use as a template that says, hey, we're expecting you to pay us, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, right? At closing, you're going to cause the agency to be paid X. And then we just slip that into number 26. It becomes part of the purchase and sale. Now, if they refuse and it's a competitive situation, that's where it becomes a little bit tough, right? Then you have to say, okay, going to have my buyer pay me, and how do I do that, right?
I think, again, like, maybe we don't make it an actual company policy, but I do like the idea of advertising sort of as a company-wide of like, this is what we're doing, like, we support even splits, and this is why we're doing it. And again, it just comes down to like educating, the general public on why. Because I think a lot of it, I don't know how many sellers will actually really know what's really going on here. And they might not, I feel like the majority of them will want as many buyers as possible, so they're not gonna mind, you know, the even split. And like you guys said, that money was never theirs to begin with. It was in that escrow account. Also, Mike has had his hand raised for a little bit, so I don't.
Oh, I'm not seeing it. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
My overall take on this is that we're gonna have to have conversations. They don't have to be tough conversations, but we just gotta know what we're talking about when we're talking about our customers. And that whether it's the seller and we have to let them know the benefit of offering that commission to a buyer, and how it's gonna deter a lot of buyers and change the whole bidding process if we don't, offer that commission. And then we're gonna have those conversations with our buyers and let them know that, hey, we need to be compensated for our work, and the seller doesn't have to pay for our services anymore. So here's some ways that you can pay for it, and sometimes we can negotiate it in contracts when we're making offers. I was in a continuing education course yesterday and was talking to a lender. And lenders are scrambling right now, trying to figure out ways to include those commission payouts for realtors so they can roll them into the loan, which would make it so much easier for the buyers to add that 2 or 3%. And I find that there's a lot of educated people out there, so it's kind of a mixed bag of these people who have seen the results on the news, are constantly asking, hey, what's this mean in Maine? And so you're gonna have those sellers who are like, I don't have to pay commission anymore, I'm not gonna. So we're gonna have to cross those bridges, but then you're gonna have the sellers who are smart, who listen to your opinion and take your advice and make it easy, and will still offer that 5% or whatever.
Yeah.
Or maybe we take, if the seller doesn't want to offer a commission to the buyer, maybe we don't go lower than 3. And if they do offer a commission, we take 5 and split 2.5, right? So we give them a little bit of a break that way, or it seems like we're giving them a little bit of a break. So there's some options, but it's gonna be knowing what you're talking about and just being able to have that conversation with either side of the table.
Yeah, it's almost like a cheat sheet too. As we figure this out, and as we get to, let's just say, the end of June, the beginning of July, we come up with something, right? And this is going to be the boiling down of a lot of discussions, a lot of input, and a lot of conversations around this whole topic about, hey, here's why, as a seller, what you need to know about this and what we recommend, right? Here's a one-pager that talks about the benefits of a buyer broker and why you want to pay them and pay them well. You, Mr. and Mrs.
Yes.
Seller.
And the data on how it can affect
Yeah.
how much you walk away with
Right.
if you choose not to.
Yeah, so that arms us, right?
Scripted conversations would be great if we could write down some scripted conversations for some agents who maybe don't have these dialed in or aren't as comfortable having those conversations. I think having some stuff in writing in a folder that everybody can access and practice and talk with their friends or family and just get it dialed in so that when they have to have that conversation with this buyer or seller, they're prepared and sound like they know what they're talking about.
Absolutely, and I think we should just do that internally, right? A group of us, or a fairly good-sized group of us, getting together and just continuing these conversations, because it's going to evolve, and we all have an opinion about it. And I think at the end of it, we're going to compile all this stuff into something that works. So I think that's great, Mike. I agree with you, and I think those are conversations, and to make sure that that's in front of a buyer and a seller to say, here's the ramifications of it. Let's talk plainly about it. But we need to give people that that context.
I can definitely put something in the agent resource folder on Dropbox that everybody has access to. We can also post on Facebook, and we can do something with like MailChimp if we want to. I can make like a template with just so that anybody can send an email from their own email out to a potential buyer with more information too, if we want to make something. I know that it's like an evolving thing right now, so maybe more mid-July, but yeah, I definitely think we need to have like something tangible so that everybody can sort of hang, and all the messages is consistent.
Yeah. Yeah, Jackie, I think maybe we set a goal of next week to come back to this, maybe towards the end of next week, so that people can have what I already put together modified. They can put their own spin on it. They can get in front of that with an email blast and then a social post or two that becomes Jake's, it becomes Mike's, right? And you modify it, you do whatever you want with that, and make it your own and spin it. But we can give you the sort of the basis of that. And then, yeah, it's probably a month from now that we have some more information. And then towards the end of June, hey, this is going into effect. Here's what we now know. Because chances are the Greater Portland Board of Realtors is going to have a session where we sit down all together and we go over the new forms. It's fairly big. So I think, yeah, this drip campaign as we know more, as we get closer to the middle of July or into July. Yeah. What else, guys?
Can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
So we want to be still using the same zip form exclusive buyer agreement, same purchase and sale, and if those get revised, they'll be in July. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, Courtney can speak to this better than I can, but go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. We should just be using the same forms we've always been. And then I'm guessing in June, there will be communications from the Maine Association of Realtors. They'll work closely with all of the local boards and Maine listings and get all of those updated. And I am positive there will be huge communications going out about that, and probably like webinars or something to explain all the updates that they're making and what that means and how you can best communicate that to your clients. Absolutely. I'd say June, like, hey, this is coming down the pike. Let's educate everybody about it. And it will be automatic too, right? Those old forms, you won't be able to get those anymore. It's going to automatically show the July 2024 when you search for exclusive, whatever in there.
Yeah, as we all know, they modify them all the time, right? That we get a new form and you're like, well, there's a new field there, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm sure we're going to have to then re-sign things with people, right? Whether the buyer representation and the listing, the exclusive right to sell, both of those are going to definitely be modified.
Yeah, that's going to affect the current buyers that you're working with right now. That's a huge point.
Yeah.
I hadn't even
Yeah.
considered.
You're going to have to re-sign with both of those parties. Again, probably beginning of July, middle of July. So interesting.
Right,
So yeah. So for the time being, though, guys, and I do think that's the other part of the message is let's go. Let's buy something now. Rates should come down here in a month or two, and it's a good time to sell. This idea of timing the markets, right? They talked about that in the stock market. Don't try to time it, right? Dollar cost average your money going in. No different than this. Let's pay attention. COVID is behind us, which made the buying and selling season sort of all seasons, right? It didn't matter. People were buying in the dead of winter. They were buying in the height of summer at the same rates. It really didn't matter. Well, we're back to a seasonal market now. And I think that's part of that message that we need to be sending out to people is there's a lot of uncertainty. That's not great for either buyers or sellers. And if you wait until the end of July thinking you're going to time this and make out somehow better, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I don't think that's the case because It's an election year. There's all that uncertainty. And we're back to seasonal spring and early summer being the best times to sell. What I talk to people about frequently is if you're not on before and really well before July 4th weekend, you missed it. You missed it. People are checking out. We only have so much good stuff here in the summer. So, don't be penny wise and pound foolish, right? Any other stuff, guys? Any other things you guys are hearing out there? I know that there's been talk about people unaffiliating with the Maine and National Association of Realtors and all of these types of things. I can tell you we have no plans for that. The blanket immunity, which they were able to get for us, is a huge deal. And I think, having these associations are a good thing. So I just want you to know that's not in the cards or anything that I'm considering about unaffiliating with the local boards or the national boards. Well, we'll circulate some stuff probably towards the end of next week, get you some things that you can potentially share. You guys can get with Jackie about getting those MailChimps sort of ready to go, sending her your list or working with her to get that content plugged into a template in MailChimp or whatever other application you use, okay? Good conversation.